How do you think it's possible to develop a meaningful new platform for business and government interaction?
Well, I think it's a great question, Gillian. I think the conference has done a good job in teeing up a lot of those topics. I think there's both too much and too little involvement of business and politics. Too much in the sense that sometimes there's a great deal of business involvement on narrow provisions that might affect a company or a small set of companies. I remember when I worked in the White House, there was a prominent lobbyist who had no idea who I was, and I was standing there with somebody else in the president's team, and he said some blank, where blank was an obscenity, got to the president and stopped him on this provision that would intervene for me, and I introduced myself as the blank. And so I think that...
We'd love to know what the blank was, but anyway.
Right, that's an issue. Having said that, I can also say that I know that business executives have been very valuable in government to tell economists, tell Treasury officials what is going on in business, particularly at turning points, say after 9/11 and the global financial crisis. That's all there. The way I see it is there's really three roles for business and government. I'd call them the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the good is the resource. So a business person who contributes expertise, a big idea, leadership skills to get it done. The bad would be the rent-seeking behavior of trying to bend the law or regulation to his or her own purpose. And then the ugly, to my mind, is the revolving door that creates this notion that there's some people who go between business and government in capacities that don't really strike one as meeting expertise. Yeah, how do you fix it is a complicated question. I think events like this are a step in the right direction, and I would argue universities actually have a big role to play because we can bring business people, government people, and academics together in an environment where no one is getting paid on neutral ground to talk.
Right, well, that's certainly a very valid point, and as you say, universities are one of the few sort of water coolers, if you like, across society, which actually allows people to interact in a casual way. But just on this issue of the revolving door, because I'd like to come back to that later on in the debate, but I have one question, which is that I was recently writing about the experiences of Philip Hildebrand, the governor of the Swiss National Bank, who, as some of you may know, went from a private sector background to become governor of the Swiss National Bank in Switzerland, was eventually forced to resign. But if you dig into some of the problems that had beset him before his resignation, it was the lack of experience in Europe of having private sector individuals in government positions. And Europe and the US have a very, very different attitude towards this revolving door concept. So when you say you're concerned about that, I mean, do you think there's things that the US could learn from Europe in that respect of keeping business and political people apart, or?
Well, I don't think we should by any means keep business and political people apart. I think business people are valuable in administrations, and there's surely people who've worked in government who have a lot to add to business. Rather, what I'm talking about are people who seem to spend a career oscillating in and out of government positions and back into business positions that aren't so much line or actual business, but more government affairs or less line parts of the business.
Right. Well, I'd love to have more of a debate about that later on. But Matthew, you have worked on both sides of the Atlantic, a fellow Brit. How do you see, with your global perspective, how do you see the issue of business and government interacting at the moment?
Well, I mean, I do think the first point is that America is quite exceptional in terms of the amount of money coming from the business world into politics. In Britain, I think it's nothing like as pervasive, and same with most of Europe. A couple of thoughts. One of the set texts we ought to be looking at is a book by Ralph Nader that he published in 2009 called Only the Super Rich Can Save Us. It's a book that I wouldn't recommend reading other than as a treatise, as a test, as a sort of academic exercise, because it's sort of unreadably long. But I interviewed him about it, and his basic thesis is that after all 40 years in politics, he believes the only way that he could achieve the kind of change that would restore democracy properly in America would be to get a group of billionaires, as he sets out in his novel, led by Warren Buffett and Ted Turner, to basically run candidates in every congressional election who they would back who had no previous record in public office, with a specific agenda to ban corporate money in Washington. I thought it was interesting because, he genuinely, I think, in that book sets out everything he's learned as an activist for 50 years in politics, which is quite interesting. But also because, in some ways, it segued with the book I wrote called Philanthrocapitalism, which is looking at the role of one of the themes of it is the role that people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and others are playing through their philanthropy and trying to solve some of the world's big problems. And it's pretty clear that they are rapidly, they're all obsessed with leverage, the notion that they have a relatively small amount of money compared to what's in government. But the way they achieve change is through somehow managing to get government priorities to shift. And so, they are all increasingly focusing on it. And one of the examples that they tend to draw on a lot historically goes back to an English chicken farmer called Anthony Fisher, who made a lot of money from his chickens and invested in the Adam Smith Institute in Britain and in the Heritage Foundation over here. There's the Walter Olin Foundation also backed the Heritage Foundation. And it's generally reckoned that the intellectual climate that those think tanks produced paved the way for Thatcherism and Reaganism and very sharp change in policy. They lay behind the development of the law and economics movement in academia, and in some ways that's produced the current Supreme Court, which is clearly more pro-business than the Supreme Court has ever been before. Just to give you some numbers, in terms of the Roberts Court has found in favor of the cases it's considered backed by the US Chamber of Commerce on 68% of occasions, compared to 56% under the previous regime, and going back to something in the low, something considerably lower in previous eras. Richard Posner, who is a conservative judge of some standing and reputation, has done a study that shows that the Warren Court in 1953 to 69 found in favour of business 29% of the time. The Berger Court, 69 to 86, 47% of the time. The Rehnquist Court, 51% of the time, and the Roberts Court, 61% of the time. So you can see a very clear backdrop of of the legal system moving in a more pro-business direction, as defined by a right-wing judge who would not take a sort of a light definition of what pro-business means. The intellectual climate is extremely important. I hesitate to bring it up, but one of the themes of the Oscar-winning movie in which Glenn starred recently was the sense was the sense that academia is the money in academia is producing an economic climate certainly amongst academic economists that was supportive to a whole series of policies and deregulation and so forth. And I don't think that's I don't think by any stretch of the imagination the movie proved its point, but I think it did raise a legitimate question that's worth debating. The other side of it is, again, I'm ambivalent. I mean, we've had this debate at The Economist about whether corporates should use their money to influence government policy. I think actually you can create a world where you can imagine corporates doing, wisely using their money to produce better regulation that actually benefits the economy and so forth. And you can see all sorts of examples where it's a bad thing. What I think ought to be the case is that in a world where more than half the capital that's invested in the stock market is capital invested by ordinary members of the public through their pension funds, that in that world, corporates ought to be transparent to their shareholders about what they're doing with that money and whether they are using that money for political purposes, so that the shareholders, who are, as institutions, the representatives of the public, can reach their own decision about whether that money is being wisely spent. Now, at the moment, there's a whole effort by various activist pension funds to try and put motions on the ballot of corporate AGMs asking for companies to be transparent about their political donations. And and that is being fiercely resisted by the US Chamber of Commerce, which has even sent lawyers along to one of the most prominent pension funds in the country to tell them that they are failing in their fiduciary, they're going against their fiduciary duty as investors in seeking that information. Because, as the Wall Street Journal editorial page put it, some of these pension funds are union representatives and therefore they're bound to be anti-business and therefore be going to use this information against the companies that they represent. I mean, that seems to me to be absolutely bizarre logic, and that I think we all ought to be able to agree that a pension fund that wants to know how its companies that it invests in is spending its money in the political system ought to have the right to ask for that information, and that ought to allow the public to have a better debate about whether that money is being well spent. And that is the number one, I would say, one or two targets of the US Chamber of Commerce at the moment to stop that happening. So while business has still got that mentality, it is very hard to see how any of us should have any confidence that they are wisely pursuing their role in politics, which they've been given as more so than ever by Citizens United.
Well, yeah, please do. I was about to ask Lewis what he thought about that. But anyway, I'll give it a moment to collect his thoughts as Glenn jumps in.
I think there's a view sometimes post-Citizens United that this unleashes a huge amount of corporate money directed at individual politicians. At least in companies where I sit on the board, we wouldn't allow the company to make political contributions. I think in many of our best companies, that's the case. I don't think that's the route through which business is influencing politics. There are other quite serious routes, but I don't think it's writing checks to politicians.
I mean, the only very quick counter to that would be that, I mean, you know, again, I've written about what sort of financial reforms were needed after the crash, and one of them seemed to be a harmonization or a rationalization of the US regulatory system, which has far too many regulators. And it was quite clear that Congress didn't want to give up any of the gravy trains that represent the committee oversight of particular regulators. So I do think they quite value the money, even if maybe that doesn't influence them. I don't know.
Lewis, would you like to comment? I mean, first of all, does Citigroup give money to direct politicians?
Not to federal politicians, because that's against the law.
And do you disclose to your shareholders what political causes you are backing or not?
We do a fair bit of disclosure, but I think the comment is right that more transparency would be a good addition to this system. I think the influence of money on politics is one issue, and we could come back to that. But to me, one of the important aspects of the question raised for this panel, the interaction of business and politics, is that in any given administration, any given period of time in our political life, it's a complicated relationship, and I think there's, to some extent, often responsibility on both sides of the relationship to do a better job. To me, at least in the recent period, there's more responsibility on the business side to do better than there is on government. On government, I think the matter is fairly simple. Any administration should want to have in the senior ranks of the government at least somebody.
Do we have a hand on?
Perhaps more than one, people who are both accessible and knowledgeable about the business world, the way business leaders think, the problems that they're likely to want to convey. Because I think it's very important in our political system that each significant interest group, I would say the same about any other group, labor organizations, environmentalists, other advocacy groups, but it's important that the interest groups that play an important role in our pluralist system of decision-making have reasonable access for making their points to somebody who's in a reasonable position of centrality and is good at providing that access and having that conversation. To me, that's the starting point. On the business side, I think it's much more complicated. And one of the curious things, the more one gets immersed in the business world, and I haven't been directly in it for very long, but I was on the fringes of it through much of my career as a practicing lawyer, law professor,
We need to get you
before I went to Citi.
The sound keeps going in and out, so either you need to take this off and hold it up to the mic, yeah. or else
Here
we have a
comes-
handheld. Yeah. So we don't want to miss any of your thoughts.
But I've noticed throughout this period that the capacity of business leaders to conduct their side of that dialogue is not very strong. And there are, I suspect John had his own experience in that dialogue and can comment on it. But as I look across the leadership in many business sectors and many companies, this goes back to a point that Glenn made, companies are good at expressing their point of view on the narrowest of issues. When they have something that's purely self-interested and they know how to express it directly, they know how to use consultants to back up the expression, they're quite good about that. What most of them don't understand is that that's not the way you build relationships that are useful over a broader territory and a longer time period. I know in my case, and I've only been directly in the business world, as I say, for six and a half years, whenever I visit a senior public official, either in Washington or other capitals around the world, I always try, as I prepare to put the couple of self-interested points I might have last on my list, and to try to think about what broader questions of public policy are worrying them at the moment, and whether I, or I on behalf of Citi, have something to contribute to that, have an idea, or a solution, or a direction, or a comment based on what we've seen in a different part of the world or a different part of the community. And I find that the most productive relationships are built in those conversations, even if at the end of the half hour or 40 minutes or whatever it is, you might say, by the way, I've got one or two points I'd like to leave with you. I'll give you one concrete example of that. I think I was the first, I may well have been the first senior executive of a bank to visit with Bill Daley when he became the chief of staff. His predecessor had essentially refused to meet with anyone who had banker on his resume, but Bill was quite accessible, obviously came himself from JP Morgan, and my staff was surprised when the request for the meeting was granted, and he and I, who've known each other a long time, done a lot of things together, spent 45 minutes together in his office and never mentioned, neither of us ever mentioned a banking issue or a regulatory issue affecting financial institutions. It was quite intentional on my part. He knew our point of view. He had been working in the industry only a week or so before, and instead I tried to think, going into the meeting, what must he be worried about, some of which he volunteered what he was worried about and asked what I thought, but we covered immigration and housing policy and trade agreements, all of which had some significance to Citi and to our industry. But I think most business leaders either don't understand, don't have the background, or don't stop and think and get the right advice about how they conduct these relationships. And so you wind up, particularly in administrations that don't start out thinking that's the most important constituency for them, you wind up with a pulling apart. And it's exaggerated when you look at the trade associations, who to some extent their reason for being is to focus on narrow issues. So in my own wanderings, I tend to try to emphasize both internally and externally the desirability of broadening the conversation, developing constructive dialogue through constructive relationships. I think in the long run that works much better.
But just to be a bit cynical for a minute, I mean, obviously it makes excellent tactical sense to go in and see the administration and to talk about anything other than Dodd-Frank. Probably much more pleasant anyway. But in practical terms, you know, if a group like Citigroup was to say, well, we have some terrific ideas about how to fix unemployment, or we have some great ideas about what to do about immigration reform. That could expose you to a lot of controversy, and many executives might say, well, it's just not worth our while. And in fact, I was at a conference or a meeting a couple of months ago with some CEOs, and one of them made the point, who works for a big global multinational financial group, that, although this individual in question is American and feels passionately about the future of America, the majority of his senior executives are not American, and for them to feel that they're getting engaged in American structural problems and how to champion America and make America better kind of flies in the face of, their wider sense of who they are as a company. How do you deal with that?
Well, that last point is obviously something we think a lot about at Citi. We have a physical presence in 110 countries, and we're approaching 70% of our revenue from outside the U.S. On the other hand, the U.S. is our domicile, and it's our headquarters. And so everything is a question of balance. Our leadership group is about evenly divided between Americans and non-Americans, and most of our interaction with public officials around the world, we don't present ourselves or think of ourselves first as an American institution. On the other hand, for some of us who are Americans, we're involved, and you can never leave your Citi hat behind in the broader discussions about the U.S. and the direction it's going. So you have to do a bit of both. In some sense, you have to be a global citizen, increasingly in this globalized and smaller world, and at the same time, you have to you have to return to your roots and play a role in that dialogue. And indeed, we encourage all of our senior people to do that in their own country. I certainly didn't mean to suggest before that we don't pursue our self-interest, but we do that in a distinctive way too that I don't think is necessarily characteristic of so many business, because the fundamental objective is to build constructive relationships in which you have credibility when you express a point of view. I think we had that kind of interaction, for example, in the whole evolution of the Dodd-Frank process. We had it with great intensity with the committee chairs and the minority leadership on the committee and many members of the relevant committees. And we had it with a good many people in Treasury, the regulatory agencies, the White House. But we had it, I think, wrapped in a broader discussion about the lessons learned from the crisis, the systemic interests that needed to be served, and how we thought best to serve them. And we also had almost a religious devotion to doing it in private. If you look back at the history of the reform debate, our public statements were very broad and very general, and almost uniformly supportive of the principle that coming out of this experience, you had to be in favor of significant reforms. The question was the details of those rules, and the more specific comments we always conveyed privately, and we continue to this day. You won't hear us being shrill or vocal or public on our, obviously some of our submissions are public, but our attempt to be impactful, I think, has helped the more private we are.
Right. John, you've seen all sides of this public-private interaction, government business. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'd like to comment on everything that's been said, but I'm going to start actually with and pick up something. It triggered a pet issue with me that Matthew said, because he put Ralph Nader and the Heritage Foundation in back-to-back sentences.
And I'm delighted this is an interactive.
And I think he didn't draw as direct a connection as he should have. And I think it's important in the way the dialogue between business and government has developed over the course of the last now 40 years. It really was the rise of Nader and a sense in the business community that they were under siege that led the Chamber of Commerce to ask Lewis Powell, who was later a Supreme Court justice, to say, what are we going to do about this? We feel like American capitalism is under siege by a bunch of people who want to regulate us to death. Powell wrote a very important, famous memo to the Chamber, which I think had a series of recommendations, one of the most important of which was you have to invest in shaping the debate through essentially idea factories like the one I run today. The business community and conservatives, I think in general, took that recommendation, and I think that they took it to and made tremendous investment in that approach to trying to shape government policy. And I think it formed a way of interacting with government that Matthew, I think, accurately characterized it as the way the Chamber now deals as almost a political combatant in the body politic. I think it's dangerous, actually, quite frankly. One could be interested on Glenn's views about whether he thinks that that the business community is well served by that kind of an organization like that being the place that's perceived as representing the broad interests of the business community. Because, again, as was noted, it can get very narrow and very nasty very quickly. That, I think, will be exacerbated. There's been some discussion about how money is going to influence politics. That will be exacerbated, I think, by Citizens United. I think it's fine to say that corporations, as Lou noted, can't directly contribute to candidates. Whether that bears scrutiny after Citizens United, I'm not convinced of. But the amounts of money that are going to go into the political system, are extreme. We've already spent 5 times as much on advertising by independent groups as at this point in the 2008 campaign, in the Republican primary. More than half of the $60 million collected by the super PACs came from 24 wealthy Americans, some highly associated with particular industries and businesses. The campaign spending by independent campaigns will probably surpass $1 billion this year. And I think that's led to some of the public attitudes that Peter kind of went over, a general sense amongst the public that the game is rigged, that they can't participate, that their role as citizens has been diminished, and I think that's quite troubling for the country. And I think it comes obviously in the wake of the great financial crisis, which itself I think was, notwithstanding Lou's characterization of having strong relationships, providing good information, a palpable sense by the American public that on a bipartisan basis over several generations, the fabric of financial regulation was eroded and evaporated and led to a crisis that caused tremendous harm, not just to the economy overall, but individual families, individual incomes. And to be able to climb out of that and restore trust, I think is going to take some real statesmanship on behalf of the business community. And I think that is best probably exemplified in the actions that Lou alluded to, which is to try to look at the big structural problems in the country and try to find some business support for that. But as I look at the list of people whose citizenship scores on Peter's scale were high and those that were low, you know, it was up there for only a second, Peter, but if you can pull it back out. I would say the people who lobby the most are at the lowest end of that spectrum. The people who spend the most money in politics are at the lowest end of the spectrum. And the people who, and the vice versa is true as well. The people who interact with Washington in a way that tends to be less self-interested, more looking at the kind of structural elements of the economy that can be strengthened to support innovation, et cetera, tend to be scoring higher on that dimension. So that ought to tell, I think, business leaders something about the way that, you know, going forward, they're going to have to interact with the political system and with the American public in general.
Right. Well, I'd like to turn to Glenn and ask him to comment on the question. But before we do that, I mean, I'm curious about this issue about the degree to which business should be regarded as a partner or a combative presence, because I've spent quite a lot of time in Brussels in recent years, and I've also been in Washington, and there's a very big difference in the way that policy is formulated there. I mean, in Brussels, what happens whenever there's an issue is that the Commission calls a conference. You get a room full of 300, 400 people from all parts of society, business leaders, academics, journalists, politicians, who sit around and have a very staged, ritualistic conference in an effort to find consensus. And I've shared quite a few of these things to discuss financial reform, and they're fantastically tedious and frustrating because everybody says their piece and it's translated into 12 languages. But somehow, at the end of that, you know, a sense of, if not consensus, but dialogue and debate emerges, and it's taken for granted that as part of that process, everybody gets around the table at dinner and talks as part, you know, in a shared group. In Washington, by contrast, you know, you look at what happened in financial reform, and it was more like a table match, you know, a tennis match. You know, you had business lob one thing over the net, and politicians bashed it back, and boom, boom, boom. And you couldn't imagine within Washington the idea of calling a conference of all the stakeholders and interested participants into one place. Now, maybe, as you're suggesting, universities are going to be the place which can actually stage these kind of European Commission-style conferences, hopefully in one language. But you know, I'm curious, how do you get that kind of dialogue or debate? And do we even want that kind of dialogue and debate between all the different groups in one place or not?
Well, I think there's
That's
actually...
a very long-winded way of asking your question, but...
Yeah, I think there's actually merits to both of what you said. I know for a couple of years, I had the privilege of chairing the OECD's Economic Policy Committee, and there were two nice things about it. One was lunch, because it was in Paris. But the second thing that was nice about it was, while it was the same set speeches in multiple languages, when there was an actual problem later to be solved, we did all know each other and know each other's point of view and could have the real conversation outside the set piece. So I think there's some advantage to players coming together, but I don't think there's any substitute for the kind of private meetings that Lou was describing. I don't think you should ever think that a big conference is going to convey the same information, at least from my perspective. To John's point,
The problem is, of course, the meetings that Lou's describing are bilateral, not multilateral. There is no mechanism within the US system for having a private, multilateral discussion between lots and lots of different stakeholders that I can see at the moment.
Well, but that's where I think, I do agree with you, and as I said before, I think universities can play that role. I mean, we are a place, whether it's this university or any of our peers, where business leaders, government leaders, and academics can come together. I think that is valuable, and I don't think it has to be reduced to set pieces, much as this conference is not a series of set pieces. So I would humbly submit we have that role. To John's point, I actually think tanks have played, not all of them, but many of them have played enormously important roles. And I think whether it's corporations or wealthy individuals, the marketplace of ideas is probably a better long-run margin to push than lobbying. I'll give you two examples from the past and one that's on the front burner. The sulfur dioxide cap and trade came from a lot of work from my profession, from economics, from think tanks. It didn't really come from a lot of direct lobbying, although I think many business groups perceive that as a better solution to an environmental problem. The second issue was tax policy. There was work over a long period of time to try to bring capital income taxes down. Whatever your view on that subject is, a number of think tanks played a big role, and I think their role probably trumped any direct lobbying role. And right now, I think the debate over the housing market, a lot of think tanks are playing a role in what's the future of American housing finance going to be. And frankly, I think their work is going to wind up being more influential than whoever's writing checks to various politicians. So I do think these think tanks have a good role to play. That doesn't mean it's always positive, but at least there are examples which I think it has been.
John, are there other examples you would add where think tanks have been crucial in pushing the debate forward?
Oh, actually, you asked about the chamber too, though, so I should say
Yeah.
something
Yes.
about that.
I know what else.
I think that the chamber's role, let's take a very specific matter on the SEC case. I think that the chamber was right on that. The Committee on Capital Markets Regulation, where I sit, we made identical arguments. Many academics made the same arguments. Was the chamber the best way to carry forward that? I'm really not sure. I'm with you on that.
This is the ruling that made it hard for shareholders to nominate
No,
candidates for the board.
yes, but the central issue, at least to my mind as an economist, was whether cost-benefit analysis in a series of SEC actions had been respected. The law required it, the SEC clearly hadn't done it. And the question is whether the chamber was the right way for that to happen, or whether economists or other interest groups might be.
I mean, it was a particularly badly chosen case given, it happened to be about selection of board members who would hold chief executives to account, I guess, which, I mean, I can imagine any other number of cases that would have been less obviously self-interested on the part of people running big companies.
Right, which is why the chamber probably wasn't the optimal.
Right, exactly. But I mean, I think then that raises
point.
another issue around, in terms of who's representing business, because, I think there is clearly a sense in which many big public companies have been, to some extent, captured by their senior executives and boards, which are, are paying themselves extraordinary amounts of money that aren't necessarily justified, that they're not really subject to proper election because of the way they control the nomination process, that moreover they're under tremendous short-term pressure from the markets, so they aren't necessarily representing even the long-term interests of the business that they're in. I mean, I certainly found there was this enormous sense of hostility to the Obama administration in the first couple of years, which often, I think, did come down to a sense that their own personal taxes were going to go up quite often. I think there was more to it than that, but I think that was certainly, there was a sense of a palpable change of mood when the Bush tax cuts were extended, which I think had far more to do in many cases with the fact that their own personal tax situation would be better than necessarily that was the best tax reform that one would have put in place at that moment in time. So then you ask a broader question about what are the interests of business, but I just think that often is a secondary issue to what's going on.
I think think tanks play an extraordinarily important role in U.S. public decision-making. And obviously they cover a wide range, and some have more analytic resources and political resources than others, and they also, some of them divide and are more impactful on one party than another. But I think when you compare the vigor and the impact of significant public policy institutes and think tanks in this country to the systems in almost every other part of the world, the difference is striking, and it works to the benefit, I think, of the U.S. process, which can often seem messy, but still has plenty of input from different places. For example, in Japan, as far as I know, there obviously are academics who have some impact, but there's one public policy institute, and it's essentially an offshoot of Kadranan, which is the business organization that was created and funded by Toyota. It's run by a former senior economic advisor to the government, and it plays a very significant role, but it's one group with about 20 staff, and in this country, I think it's much more robust.
I'm going to send this last set of comments to my donors, but
I was
Julie,
gonna say,
can I
does-
comment just briefly on your distinction between Europe and the U.S. and that more collegial capacity to bring business, labor, other players to the table. And you talked about the commission process, which is like slightly zany, but I think there's even a more direct example in the wake of the market crash, which is what happened in Germany. Now that was perhaps at a unique moment where there was a coalition government, but the Social Democrats, the Chancellor Merkel and her coalition partners, key CEOs, the heads of the business units, the heads of all the major unions in Germany locked themselves in a room for, I think, something like 36 hours, came out with a package of response, including that, really extending that idea of reducing worker hours so that you didn't have that deep drop in unemployment. And Germany, for probably a lot of different reasons, but I think one of the reasons was that they had social cohesion around that package, stabilized, consolidated, and began its growth path more quickly than most of the rest of the economies. The banking sector is probably different. Maybe there's a lot of different factors involved with that, but you could not imagine that happening in the United States. That same process of sort of give and take between those sectors and a decision that was tough with respect to both concessions that were being made, not by just the political parties, but by the stakeholders in the economy, taking place around the table convened by the president and the majority leader. At least today, you couldn't imagine that. I think perhaps that's a function of the fact that our parties have sorted out in a way that there is some extent we now have more polarized philosophical positioning of our parties, so it's maybe harder to come to the table. But I think the other players, institutional players, just don't see they still see their role as largely in an advocacy capacity, a kind of winner-take-all capacity, or at least, do as little damage to your self-interest as possible. And so there are different models that I think could be effective, but it's sort of hard to imagine how one transitions the U.S. model into something that's more cooperative and collaborative.
Well, I think you put your finger on an extremely good point there. Germany, of course, does have this tradition of worker councils attached to businesses, and I think they've played a key role not just in simply maintaining a sense of, if you like, cohesion, but also in practical purposes, as you say, allowing to have Germany to produce downward labor wage flexibility, which has boosted the productivity in recent times. But to my mind, one of the other fascinating examples is Japan, because as a country where I worked for a number of years, and I remember very clearly going to talk to a CEO during the Japanese financial crisis, who said to me, well, we as a company, we have to cut our wage bill by 20%. So of course, we're going to cut everybody's wage bill by 20%, and cut my wages by 30%. And I said, of course. And he went, yes. And there was a pause, wonderful man. He went, well, of course, if it was England, you'd probably cut the workforce by 20%. And there was another pause. And he went, and if I was American, I would cut the workforce by 40% and pay me 20% more. But, within that joke, that question of, cohesion and consensual decision-making versus a system which is built on conflict and combative ways of trying to reach a decision is very crucial. Can you imagine a situation where you would be able to sit down in Citigroup with politicians in a collegiate fashion today?
I don't think that dialogue.
Or with unions and politicians.
Let me answer it in the union context, because as John knows, I was involved in a only half successful temporary effort to do just that towards the second half of the Clinton administration. Jack Welch and John Sweeney had the idea of putting together group of trade union presidents and CEOs, not to talk about specific labor management issues, but to see if they could have a constructive exchange about major policy questions, education, economic issues, and trade. And they did that. President Clinton came to the first meeting to tell them how important their effort would be if it reached results. They actually quickly discovered at the first meeting, I gather, that they couldn't get going in that constructive dialogue without a moderator, and somehow, I think with some help from a couple of people in the administration, they settled on me, and I became, for about 4 years, the moderator of these few times a year when they got together for an evening. Ultimately, it floundered in part over political divisions that developed in 2000, as we all know, and partly over personnel changes on both sides of the table. But those kind of efforts pop up every now and then. My own view is that they're very worthwhile, but it doesn't mean that results or consensus is easy. It's not. But unless you have the mechanism and the regularity of relationship building, you don't have much chance of getting started.
I'm going to open the debate up to audience questioning in a minute, but before I do that, I have one quick question I'd like to ask each of you. I was very struck by some of the research, which early today, and we were discussing last night, suggesting that the number of lobbyists have gone up dramatically in recent years. 15,000 lobbyists, $3.6 billion or whatever spent on lobbying. I'd like to ask you each in turn, quickly, do you think there are too many lobbyists? Would the world be better with 5,000, not 15,000?
Well, I confess I don't know the optimal number of lobbyists, but
I'm sure there's an economic model somewhere.
As with lawyers, except Lou, of course, there's the view that we may have too many. And I think for lobbyists, there are valuable things lobbyists do, of course, providing information and so on. But I think the large number of lobbyists isn't so much a statement about whether there are too many lobbyists as to what sort of process have we created that would lead to that growth, which means businesses invest in things where they see a return on that investment. And so it must be that this sort of self-interested pressure of lobbyists is rewarded. So I wouldn't ask the question about lobbyists, but more what kind of processes could we put in place that might drain that?
Matthew? I mean, you've probably seen the chart too. It's astonishing, the chart. I mean, the numbers going up so sharply.
It is. I was going to actually ask Glenn, after he'd said what the right number of lobbyists was, what the right size of tree is, given your closeness to Mr. Romney. I wonder whether you had an algorithm for that one.
I think what he said is the trees in Michigan were about the right height.
I've never heard anyone stand up in Washington.
I don't know. I mean, I think these lobbyists, I mean, I think they, by and large, a case can be made that they cancel each other out often, and it's not. I mean, I think they're symptomatic of the problem. There's too much money going into politics. I think if we had transparency about them, we'd have a much better sense of whether they were creating value for money. I think the sheer number in its own doesn't really tell us very much. I also worry that, I mean, they tend to be classically focused on the small issues, and I think one of the points that we haven't raised so far is the extent to which we are in this extraordinary transformational point of history where the globalization is driving business, and business is having to navigate this movement away from having a nationality to being global, and that poses huge challenges to what its relationship with the body politic in each country is. And I think on the one hand creates enormous need for businesses to establish a license to operate in all sorts of parts of the world through being more engaged corporate citizens, but at the same time does present a lot of challenges to their existing relationship where they may feel probably their business interests run counter to what's expected of them as a country. And I think part of that globalization process is going to destroy a lot of jobs, and has already destroyed a lot of jobs in the rich world. And business is going to be one of the primary drivers of that destruction process, which is naturally going to make the public more and more hostile towards business. So there are these huge macro-political issues, which I don't think lobbyists in any way help us address. So there needs to be a different class of operator in the business world that's able to engage with those issues and help the public think through them.
Fascinating. International super lobbyists.
Whatever they are. I don't know what they are, but...
I love the idea of lobbyists being like derivatives contracts, and they kind of all net each other out eventually.
First of all, I think
Would you like to have less lobbyists?
there's a growing list of international super lobbyists as well. Look,
How many lobbyists? Do you know how many lobbyists Citigroup would employ?
I probably can't count that high.
Do you know how it's grown, actually? That's more...
I do, but here's the way I would express my point of view. I think government affairs, or public policy, which I prefer to call it, is of growing importance, particularly in big multinational companies. And it is not just defense, it's not just thinking of things you can stop and how to use lobbyists to help stop them. It's more creative than that. Companies need to look around the corner and think about the way public policy affects their plans and ambitions, and they need to have really smart people who understand the public policy world doing that, and more of them. When I came to Citi in mid-2005, there were very few countries where we had a full-time government affairs and public policy person, and now there are a very large number. And so I think that function is very important. What role lobbyists play in supplementing that? I agree with Matthew that I think it tends to be a supportive role. It tends for some companies to expand access, for other companies to expand coverage in the sense that your core staff can't maintain all the relationships you'd like to on a particular issue. I think one of the dirty little secrets is it's actually pretty cheap help when you compare it to lawyers or investment bankers or other professional services that you use. And so if you're a big company with a big interest in a set of public issues, there's a great temptation to keep adding relatively inexpensive consultants to make sure you've covered all the bases. It's not the prettiest part of our system, but on the other hand, I don't think fundamentally, I mean, it ties into the money issue. That's a different subject. But I don't think fundamentally it's one of the biggest problems either.
So just quickly, before I ask John about that, would you expect, that 15,000 number to turn into 30,000 in 5 years' time? I mean, is Citigroup, Lewis? Yes, I mean, would you expect that number to turn into 30,000? Is Citigroup expanding?
I think some variety of what has happened in the U.S. is going to happen in other societies as their economies expand, as their markets expand, as their cross-border activity, economic activity expand. You can just see and feel it happening. Is that going to make for a better world or better public decision making, particularly when you apply it to all kinds of different political systems for public decisions? I don't know, but I do tend to think that at its core, the sort of pluralist system of democracy that we have is a pretty good way to make decisions. Not always neat, but not so bad overall, and that depends on representational forces, including aids to the representation.
Well, it certainly means at least one part of the Western economy is experiencing job creation.
Well,
John.
and it's one of the reasons why the DC commercial real estate space is probably stronger than most of the rest of the country. I probably should start by, in the interest of transparency, noting that for me it's a little bit of a family business. My brother and I started a lobby firm in the mid-1980s, which after I left the Clinton administration I didn't go back to, but he remains a important and successful lobbyist in DC on the Democratic side. But I think really what it is it's a reflection of the fact that government policy has become so critical to the functioning of the economy in a really complex system. And I think my ex-boss, Bill Clinton, is fond of saying these days that he can't think of an example around the world of a country who has made the decision that having a government that essentially is the problem and therefore incapacitated is the solution to any particular long-term growth path. That you need a functioning government. We can debate what the question of the size is, but there's so many places where the federal government interacts to create a platform for private sector success that I think it's really more a reflection of the complexity of the economy, the globalization of the economy, and the role of federal policy in kind of shaping policies for failure or success in that context. And people have, I think, gravitated into trying to come in and shape that. But it can be, I think, a profit center also for certain industries. My favorite example would probably be oil and gas, which has a tremendous return on investment from the money that it spends, both in terms of campaign contributions to the particular members who make decisions about that, and to lobbying the Congress. So that with a tremendous energy challenge facing the country, the need, whether that's from the perspective of security challenge, of the amount of oil we're importing, the effect that it has on balance of payments, the effect that it has on the climate, the status quo wins out. The five top integrated oil and gas companies have had $1 trillion worth of profit over the last decade, and yet they retain significant tax breaks that Obama's tried to get rid of, other people in the past have tried to get rid of, but they stay in place for a relatively insignificant investment, I think, from their perspective. We did a calculation at my think tank that suggests that they got about a 3,000% return on investment. That's pretty good if you think about what they're spending and what they're getting in return. That's a pretty good return on investment. Now, many industries, I think, don't even their perspective is actually quite different, and they really are just trying to shape kind of macro economic policy that in which they operate. I've over the years done a lot of work in intellectual property. You saw that debate. Again, Peter was talking about social media. You can see how social media is beginning to affect politics. You saw that debate over the online privacy fight between the intellectual property holders, the record industry and the movie industry, and people that in Silicon Valley that operate to try to keep the internet as unencumbered as possible. And guess what? The citizens won in that fight, notwithstanding a lobbying campaign that was actually quite sophisticated, quite good, that was mounted by the intellectual property industries. Whether that was a good result or a bad result overall for the U.S. economy, I'm not sure. But I think that's just one micro example of the way decisions that are going to be made on Capitol Hill are going to kind of shape the environment in which these companies operate, and therefore. I think 15,000 probably will grow to 30,000. Wow. Maybe they'll be dispersed. Maybe it'll either, as Lou suggested, go to international capitals or to state and local environments where you see, again, the same kind of pickup of the amount of resources that people are spending on trying to influence government at every level.
Fascinating. 3,000% return is pretty impressive. Have you tried comparing that to other lobbying efforts, or did you publish that figure?
Yeah, we did.
All right.
I don't know. We'll go back and we'll check out. We'll try to calculate that for the finance industry.
That would be. I'd love to know from the finance industry what the if you look at the Volcker rule or something like that.
It's in oil and gas. It's easier because you can. It's easier to find the direct result of the federal tax breaks that they get and maintain and extend.
Right. Anyone like to ask some questions from the floor? We got one right at the back, I believe, and one and then two. I believe we've got some, and then three. I think we've got some microphones, or we might have kidnapped the microphone. Great. It would be courteous, although not compulsory, if you can identify yourself. And also direct. If there's somebody you want in particular to answer your question, please do indicate that. And do also keep the question short, because I can see quite a few hands already, and we want to make sure we can get through them.
Great. My name is Jonathan Jacoby. A bit of a personal comment and then a question for both John and for Glenn, if possible. I mean, I feel like there's a bit of biography for me in terms of the day's discussion, because what motivated me to study here on both sides of this building was seeing how the McCain-Feingold Act, which feels like ages ago, but only 10 years ago, wasn't holding. Even a year or two later, by the 2004 election, we saw the 527s emerging, what we heard about this morning. Since then, super PACs and so on. So the motivating question for me, and I will get to a question, it was, is there a way, if you can't beat them, in a sense, with business having a larger and larger impact in terms of politics, having more and more of a recognized voice and speech in politics, can you join them? And I posed the question almost obsessively when speakers, like these, came to campus to then say, well, is there a way to meet the companies where they are in terms of their sustainability commitments, their commitments to global economic growth, and carry that into how they engage in lobbying and engage in the policy process, and a way to carry some of their transparency commitments that's been a theme over the last few decades of corporate responsibility, again, into lobbying, so it's not so opaque. And I mean, it led me then to John's shop to work on these issues at CAP, and having been here with Dean Hubbard, again, it feels like biography. But what I want to share is just the last few years has been an experiment for me at Oxfam in actually trying this out. And I'd be curious what your perspectives, John and Glenn, would be of this, which is that we've tried out a joint lobbying, essentially, with companies that you'd never expect a group like Oxfam to partner with, where we thought there was a shared interest, or at least an instrumental interest. And so far, so good, actually. Climate change issues, there was a critical mass of companies that actually saw an interest, as with labor, in seeing a comprehensive climate and energy bill. Foreign aid reform was at least a safe one for companies, assuming they knew what it was about. So there was an education process. So is there a way in which we can think about businesses' engagement in politics differently, such that they're bringing their, again, wave of corporate responsibility commitments into policy in a way that can be constructive on any of the issues that are compelling to you both?
So, is CSR the solution?
Well, I think that there are lots of ways to do it. You mentioned foreign aid. I know the Shell Oil Company has been very active in that regard with a lot of NGOs. Certainly the Bernstein Center that Bruce runs at Columbia and the Social Enterprise Program in Columbia Business School routinely bring together firms in the social sector with firms in the private sector for areas of common interest. So I think that's absolutely very important, and I could see it in things ranging from climate change, where one big think tank, Resources for the Future, has played a role in bringing players together. So whether it's think tanks, universities, social sector leaders, I think that is a live conversation. And that is a way, your question was exactly spot on, of piggybacking on the efforts business is trying to do and hold business accountable.
Yeah, first of all, I think CSR is kind of an outmoded concept. I think it's kind of a sense that some officer in the company will be responsible for doing good deeds on behalf of the company, and the public community will find a way to reward the company for that. I think that if you look at where leading edge global companies are going, they're developing, and I think Peter's data really directed us towards that. They're going towards a commitment to sustainability, a commitment to interfacing with their publics in a way that's more honest, and their actions, good or bad, will be more susceptible to public scrutiny. And I think if you build that into your business model, you're likely to be able to find common cause with groups like Oxfam or others who are pushing to have a policy directed in a way that's going to be strong for growth within the company and good for the purpose of the company and the branding of that purpose, which I think will help you attract better human capital, will bring people into the business and help you succeed. And so I think that I saw some people flinch when I said corporate social responsibility is an outdated model, but I think the days of having that corporate social responsible executive stuck off in a corner who never really participates in the core business decisions of the company is really probably something of 10 or 20 years ago. And I think that the companies that are going to be successful in the future are going to adopt a different model. And I think, again, I come back to the effect of social media on being able to hold people accountable for what they state their corporate strategies are and their corporate purposes are, will, I think, influence companies going forward, and the best in the breed will be rewarded for that. So I think there's a future in that kind of coalition aspect, because I think the companies themselves have something to learn from NGOs and vice versa. And NGOs have something to learn from trying to drive business models that will solve social problems in the most effective way without creating potential downside in the process.
Well, there's clearly a lot of truth to that. And I do think, as this is an academic conference, one of the things that I've been talking a lot about recently under the philanthrocapitalism header is the extent to which we need to redefine civil society to include a role for the business sector rather than to say it as running contra to the business sector. I think increasingly, people whose motivation is to achieve social change will go and work for a business because they see that as the most effective way they can drive that, whereas in the past I don't think that would necessarily have been the case. However, the biggest challenge, I think, this is a transitional phase, is that public companies are under this extraordinary short-termism constraint, which is driven by the way the financial markets work, and that has all sorts of consequences at the moment. Not least that the people who tend to get promoted to leadership position tend to be those that are most capable of blinding themselves to the long-term consequences of their actions when those cost money. And so you get actually a bad cadre of leaders who win out over those who understand the long-term enlightened self-interest of their companies. And until we fix this corporate governance issue, which is that our shareholder institutions just by and large are not acting in the interests of us, whose money they are supposed to be investing wisely for the long term, we're not going to really get business, I think, make that transition anywhere near as far as one senses the best leaders want to move. And so it's going to be it's going to be much more susceptible to being regarded as tokenism than it could be or should be if we really had long-termism to the fore.
Got a question there, and then another question, I think, over there. So 1, 2, and then 3 if we get enough time. Just behind, actually. Yeah.
Bob Hertz, I'm an executive in residence at Columbia Business School. Think tanks, their role and impact came up in the discussion, and maybe unfairly, when I think of major Washington think tanks, I group them into different groups, including those that have strong ideologies and therefore partisan ties versus ones that are at least they say they're nonpartisan. And I kind of wondered whether the credibility and impact differs at all as between those two groups.
John, have you tried doing a...
I'm the worst person to answer that question. Since I clearly have built and run a think tank that has a kind of philosophical perspective and holds itself out as progressive, I think the work we do bears scrutiny. We live in a fact-filled rather than a fact-free zone. But our model is to try to drive social change by having ideas that are relevant to the political philosophy that's more progressive. And we work with conservatives. I'm running or just have completed a major set of studies with Steve Hadley, who was George Bush's national security advisor, on how to do the political and economic transition in Afghanistan as we transition on the military side. So I think we try to work in a bipartisan way, but no one doesn't understand that we have a philosophical perspective. In some ways, that I think makes us more effective with the people who are like-minded, and I think the people who are not like-minded are more skeptical of what research products we produce. And other people have different business models for that.
Yeah, I think the way I would describe it, Bob, is that I don't think there's a problem with the philosophical bias. I really admire what John has done at CAP, because in my view, prior to his think tank, on the left, there were fewer places producing original ideas. And to me, the battle is over original ideas. And then we will persuade or not politicians, the public, students, but you have to have the ideas. So the way I think of the think tanks is people who are producing original ideas and people who are just commercializing and writing fact sheets. And some of those are on the right and some of those are on the left. But I think there's great value, whether it's left, center, right, in real ideas and then tugging it out.
Okay.
I was just interested, Alec Obius from Columbia Business School. I was interested to hear whether the speakers have any suggestions on reform proposals that Congress may pursue in terms of lobbying. All of the speakers have touched on the issue that this is hugely profitable, and that lobbyists are cheap, and companies can extract huge profits and huge rents from this, and that this would probably be a good idea for Congress to try and rein this in. Whether or not Congress can do something about that is another issue, but I was wondering if there are reform proposals that you may have in mind.
I'm not sure whether there's a lack of demand, whether Congress is going to actually want to kill the golden goose, really, in that sense. I mean, there was a Facebook app that ran before Christmas, which had, I think it was Barney Frank or John Boehner, wearing a NASCAR outfit with all the different sponsors that they had all over it, which, my reform proposal, rather flippantly, is that every congressman should be required to wear such a suit, listing their top 20 sponsors. But I do think more seriously, the media, CNN, or CNBC nowadays, routinely, when it has a money manager on, requires them to state who they've got positions in. And I think that, I don't know why you wouldn't have a ticker on television every time a politician appears listing their top 10 financial backers from industry or what other source of money it is. But I think that's something where maybe the media could take a lead, because it seems to me that unless it becomes a matter of embarrassment to Congress people that they are taking money from those sources, they're hardly likely to be the people we can trust with reining it in.
Good point. Yeah, and I'd also like to ask Lewis's thoughts on that. But John first.
Just two things. One, which we have alluded to but haven't really nailed, is that this growth of the lobbying industry is closely tied to the campaign finance question. Most of what the lobbyists do is raise money for congressional campaigns. It's much less, I think, a factor in the presidential elections, but it's a very critical factor in being able to provide campaign funding resources directly to members of Congress. And I think that anything you could do to kind of break that link, I think, will help a little bit. I spend relatively little time worrying about lobbying reform, and I'll tell you why. It seems to me that the way one restores a kind of sense of the ability that government can be effective is moreover on actually the reform of government itself and the execution of government and increasing productivity from government. And so, people used to make fun of Al Gore breaking the ashtray, or every administration has their sort of effort. Obama vested it with the guy who now is running the Office of Management and Budget, who was the deputy director for management, Jeff Zients, to try to actually increase the efficiency, effectiveness, and productivity of government. I think will do more to reassure the American people that they have a government that they can be proud of than any number of additional restrictions on revolving door or whatever. There are already so many, you can't keep count of them. So it's kind of, I see that as having diminishing returns, and moving towards that effectiveness of government, I think, is a more productive area.
Lewis, do you spend much time worrying about lobbying reform?
No, I tend to agree with John that that's not the most useful direction for our work. I would favor more transparency, more disclosure on both sides of the equation, but I don't think fundamentally it's going to make terribly much difference compared to the potential contribution that could be made by any good idea to improve the functioning and efficiency of government, as John said. Across all the ideological divisions in this country, I think people would like to see more effective decision making and less impasse and less partisanship. The partisanship is what wasn't always with us, but I think there's no question that changes in media, technology, lifestyle, all the rest have changed our politics and have changed the way our elected representatives spend their time and live their life while in office, and not for the better in terms of their relationships across the aisle or their capacity to make decisions in a productive way. It's very hard to think of how to improve that. Some of it is just the different times that we live in. But I know I always tell my children, I went to work in the Senate, on the Senate staff, right after I graduated from law school in 1967. And one of the first things the senator I was working for told me on the first day was, I'm with certain members of the opposite party to learn about how the body functioned and how they thought about the job. And he also mentioned some people in his own party with whom he had almost nothing in common ideologically, but they had been in the Senate a long time. I think those kinds of relationships, there are examples, John knows a lot of them, which work effectively on individual issues, but systematically it's not the same. And I think, unfortunately, it's not easy to legislate changes. The changes come about because of the changes in the society.
Well, I think that we are actually just about out of time. Do we have time for one more quick question? Okay. All right. Well, in that case, I am going to leave it to Glenn to sum up all this in a masterful way in his next comments. I think you're down for giving the closing keynote and remarks, which I will consider to be a closing conclusion and overview. But it just do any of you other three have anything more you want to add as a last thought before we go into the last session?
It's frightening to leave the last word to Glenn, but I think we should do it.
I think it's called force majeure. It's like, what you get if you're dean.
Just ask him to explain how we're going to fund the government with 15% of GDP.
Well, anyway, it just reminds me to say a very big thank you to all of you for a very provocative debate. I think it's revealed both the level of interest in these issues at the moment, particularly given the current 2012 race, and also the state of the economy and business climate today, but also the sheer difficulty in actually embracing it. I must say, from my own point of view, what I take away from this is, firstly, you need to get the stakeholders to talk to each other somehow. No single group can actually solve this by itself. I think Glenn's idea about the university being essentially the water cooler for American society, around which different groups can actually congregate and talk in a less polarized fashion, is a very interesting one to explore. And lastly, I do think these issues need to be put in an international context, not just because there's a lot that America can learn from elsewhere and other countries can learn from America, but also because business these days is international. And as Matthew says, trying to frame this purely within a national debate is simply outdated and wrong. But anyway, those are my thoughts. I leave them to Glenn to provide some rather more erudite thoughts. And thank you all once again.
Thanks so much, Gillian. And to John, I guess I would just say, there you go again. I would commend you to Governor Romney's fact sheet on exactly how to do that. I'm actually not the real closing remarks, which I think go to my colleague, Bruce Kogut, but I think I'm here more in a titular capacity from Columbia Business School, because a lot of the topics that came up at this conference, and especially in this panel, cut to the core of what is really at the forefront of business and business education. You know, there are only three things that distinguish any great producer of knowledge, and a great university like this one obviously falls into that camp. It's about ideas, it's about talent, and it's about network. And you've spent a day talking about ideas with an amazingly talented group of people, and I do think the network aspects that have been talked about today of bringing business together with government and not just in opposition to government make a lot of sense. I'd like to say a huge note of thanks to my colleague Bruce Kogut and the team at the Bernstein Center, as well as ISERP, for helping make this conference possible, and especially to Raghu Rajan and Peter Stringham for keynote remarks too. I think this is a hugely important discussion that we've had. The conference's topic, to my mind, just speaking as an economist, is both important and comes at an important time. Public policy has been extremely active on the business turf. That's not a Republican or a Democrat observation. It's simply an observation of what has been a dramatic shift in recent years. Now, part of that is because the world has become a more complicated place. So to your question about lobbying, I would say that you would expect a large growth in lobbying in a world that's a harder place. Members of Congress have to get their information just as we all do. But second, there's a trend that came up in Peter's remarks that trust in government and in business elites is really at an all-time low. And I don't care what your political point of view is, that ought to be a clarion call for concern. The discussion in the conference and the topics that have taken place here are wide-ranging and interesting. I would just use my few minutes with you just to think about three questions about business leaders and about politics. The first question is this: are business leaders actually valuable in this context, that is, in the discussion of politics? Now, not always. I remember when I served in the White House, there was a cabinet member, who I won't name, who was a very wealthy and distinguished businessman, and whenever we had an argument, he would say to me, well, but I'm richer than you are. And I said, well, X, the cabinet member's name, that's not a very high bar to jump over. I am a teacher, you are a CEO. And it's not clear that the biography of simply being a business person is what the doctor ordered, despite the fact that many business people think that the mere fact of being a business person gives them some leg up. On the other hand, I think there's enormous value, and I would actually say it's essential, given how complicated the world is, to have some members of either an administration or people talking to congressional leaders who have significant business experience. Partly that's because of the level of technical detail that's required. Dodd-Frank has come up today. The amount of understanding from a pure financial markets perspective, from a business perspective, from an economic perspective of how to remake financial regulation, to my mind, makes it an overreaching imperative to talk to business leaders. Second, I think something business leaders, at least good ones, are good at is integration. That is, they are able to take fairly complicated patterns and settings around the world and put them together. Politicians often less so, and business people in that mix can provide a perspective that's harder to get from political leaders alone. So question one, are business leaders valuable? Perhaps not for the reasons they say, the biography, the mere fact of being a business person, but yes, from their expertise and their skill. The second question I'd like to pose is, well, where are business leaders? I had a dinner with a group of business people about a year ago, and everyone in the room was a CEO or a leader of a prominent enterprise. And I said I didn't think there were very many, if any, business leaders in America today. And people looked at me like I was from Mars, or who invited that kid, or some sort of look. And what I meant by that was not that these men and women hadn't run large things or hadn't made a lot of money, but that I didn't see them active on big stages. So last night at the dinner, I mentioned that the Marshall Plan was actually sold and shepherded by business people. Now, they didn't do it out of altruism, really. I mean, some of them may have said they did. They did it because they realized that a Europe that would slip into economic deprivation or perhaps into communism couldn't possibly be in the interest of American business, and they took an isolationist Congress and tried to turn it around. The Marshall Plan was then implemented by a business executive, Paul Hoffman, not by a bureaucrat from the State Department. Now, again, this isn't about saying business leaders have to step up, if you will, and consider social problems, rather that social problems ought to be part of their common fabric. When I think about what makes great business schools special, and obviously I would tout our own here at Columbia, it's that every business school student has an interest in the social sector and social problems, not because many of them are going out to run not-for-profits, although some of them will, but because those people feel that that broad context is important, and they're right. If you look at what happened in the financial crisis and the failures of a lot of business leaders, it wasn't from a deficiency in IQ, and it wasn't even from a deficiency in understanding finance. It was a deficiency in integrating big problems and understanding context, and that context reflects history, it reflects politics, it reflects government, and it reflects understanding the world around you. So I think to the question of where are business leaders, they're there when we have business leaders that have that broad sense of context. And when they step up to the big stage, I don't think we ought to necessarily hold them to account of this is Saint X or Saint Y, but as somebody who really, really understands the importance of context. The third question, and in some sense the most important, at least sitting as somebody in a business school, is how do we create more of these business leaders, if that's who they are, and get them involved in politics. I do think, as I mentioned on the panel and has come up, that universities play an absolutely crucial role here. I can imagine not only this university, but any of our top university peers, say new groups of like a new type of group of 30 that would bring together young up-and-coming business leaders, the people who will be young and up-and-coming political leaders and academics to really talk about long-term problems and work them out. What great business schools do, I think what this one does, is really work with people on how to connect the dots of difficult problems and difficult patterns, and I think universities are good at that. In my vision of that, the next Bayh-Dole, so the next big change in public policy toward innovation might come from that discussion. What's the actual alternative to too big to fail instead of talking about it? What kind of bankruptcy regime? What kind of bail-in regime? Let's be real. That could come out of that discussion. And a rethinking of labor policy that moves away from pablum on one side that says we just need a lot of unemployment insurance and pablum on another that says, well, the market will work it out. How can we work out the best labor policy for our country in a global economy? So as I think about what happened in this conference, the reason I think Bruce and colleagues struck such a chord is these questions about business and politics, albeit building on contemporary issues where this is on the front page of the paper, are on these lower frequency issues that really ought to get us concerned in the country about how we get business leaders involved and how we create them. So with that, thanks again. Welcome to Columbia Business School as well. Any of you who are alumni, welcome home. And to students, enjoy the day. And I'm going to turn it over to the real concluding comments, the person who would never let me have the last word, Bruce Kogan.
Forth of Peter showed us, is that there is a sense maybe that they're not the trusted figures of America right now, and that they are somewhat vulnerable to a lot of serious criticism, sometimes correct, sometimes wrong. So what's different about now than it was after World War II, Marshall Plan? Well, World War II was a great unifying event. People walked out together in a sense that the world that was in bad shape, the U.S. Just won a war, and some things to actually be done. We just went through a financial crisis. Not exactly the same unifying experience as reading a World War II event. And it's going to be a little bit harder job than that. And Lou Kaden, who's so kind to come here to speak to us today on this subject, as Lou always does, very openly. We discussed this earlier about who is the business leader, who speaks for business in these times. We talked a little about Jamie Dimon, very impressive statement he made again before. I always talk about this in 2009. Britain Pandit went on to the Charlie Rose show and talked about these issues. But there probably is a lack of articulation sometimes from the business community these days on what they actually can do to solve the problems which exist. So ultimately, I don't know, the answer to lobbyists. We had Marty McClellan speaking really well about what lobbyists do. We had Greg Gordon telling us about what the advertising spend. We talked about David Lazare, we talked to us about the campaign contributions. So we hit all the money paths, if you wish. We're not quite sure about the consequences of all that money. It's kind of reassuring, perhaps. It's not so easy to figure this stuff out. And we would like to do that. But ultimately, I think people are saying, both the audience and also the folks coming from outside the university, so there are some pretty structural problems here which are very deep, which need to be addressed. Gillian Tett, Financial Times, unsurprisingly, says this is not just a U.S. problem. It's a global problem. We chose to have this as a national discussion, which I spent 8 years in France where I heard a lot about the French exception. As it says, which is great. I actually forgot that there was a thing called the American exception. I completely forgot that. I was shocked when I first year I got back to hear all this stuff. But it's probably true of every national debate. It's not really about global issues so much, but about the things they actually do. So what is it, if you look around, what do this conference have learned overseas which is not present in this one? I think one of the striking things about the U.S., which is different than overseas, is the lack of presence of labor in any of these discussions. Really what we're talking about is more competitive the U.S., which is really critical to us. For whatever reason, labor is not well represented in business schools too much, nor are they registered, of course, nationally in the U.S. Now, someone asked me, do I mean labor with a small L or a big L? By and large, I mean the small L. Labor generally, when we talk about labor, I'm not talking about labor policy, actually mean labor as a sort of voice on these matters. And it does seem, in the data we have, that labor does play a very important role around the world in curbing some excesses which afterwards business might even regret having indulged in, such as very excessive executive compensation. This doesn't be this balance which actually is required. Now, Bob, I didn't see you, Bob, here. Perhaps you can come forth just for a second and speak to that big point, and then I'll close with a thank you to Bob on this issue. So, Bob, maybe you speak to that. I asked Bob to say a word here. I was looking for this volunteer before. I should have known that Bob would move to my right and my left.
Well, thanks. Role for me to be closing this. I think what I took away from this was a sense that, of course, business has an enormous amount of influence. Thank you. The Wall Street Journal recently published an article that reported that J.P. Morgan Chase has 100 task forces working on the rulemakings under Dodd-Frank on derivatives, which is more than the Commodity Futures Trading Commission has people. So as income and wealth has become more concentrated, you would expect business to have more influence. You'd expect business to have more influence in the usual ways. It has more money, it has more expertise, it has more ground troops, it has more allies in government. And at the dinner last night, I mentioned a piece I have in the current issue of the American Prospect called Tocqueville for Toffs, meaning that if you recall Alexis de Tocqueville's observation that Americans thrive on associations, nowhere are associations thriving more than among the very, very wealthiest and best connected people, whereas among the bottom 70 or 80%, associations have all but collapsed. So the question is not so much whether business has influence. Just look at the past 30 years. Of course business has escalating influence. The question is it influence for good, for evil, for neutral? And what is the relationship of that increasing influence to the situation of the rest of the society, particularly for labor with a lowercase l? And I think if you recall the comments of the day, you realize that social scientists can tell many, many different stories about what has happened over the past 3 or 4 decades. Was it the result of technological trends, globalization, increasing returns to skill that just naturally caused the income distribution to become more concentrated? Or was it the fact that business, after an unusual period that ran from about 1933 to about 1970, where the usual influence of business in a market economy was constrained as fallout from the Great Depression, the New Deal, and the World War II, came roaring back to its normal place in society, and as a result, what Galbraith called the countervailing institutions that offset the influence of business and led to a stronger labor movement, led to other public policies that created a more egalitarian income distribution, fell away, and we've returned more to a period like the 20s or like the 90s, 1890s, in which the business of America is business. I think there are elements of truth in both stories.
But to conclude, I think in my own work, I have found that there is what you might call a zone of indeterminacy, where a fairly broad range of income distributions can coexist with a productive, innovative market economy. And the less we become a manufacturing economy and the more we become a service economy, the more we have the ability to make those decisions as social decisions. What you pay a nurse, what you pay a school teacher, what you pay a home health aide is as much a social decision as it is an economic decision, because it doesn't really affect the direct competitiveness of your economy in the same way that what you pay a steel worker or a textile worker does. These are as much social decisions as they are economic decisions. And one hopes that as business has become more influential in setting these policies, business will take, as Alfred Nader seems to have said in his model, more enlightened self-interest about what's good for the society overall, and not just what's good for business in a narrow sense. An article that Vasily Leontiev, Nobel Prize winner in economics, wrote in 1973 in Science magazine, where he does the parable of the one-worker industrial economy. And he says, we're going to get to a point where the whole industrial economy is so efficient and so productive, there's going to be one worker, and her job is going to be to flip the switch. And then the question is, what do the rest of us do for a living, and what do we get paid? And that's a decision that is as much, it seems to be a social decision as it is a narrowly economic decision in the sense of the usual assumptions of free market economics. So I hope that as business has obviously become more influential in society, that business,
even though Milton Friedman would say this is a terrible idea, looks beyond its narrow self-interest or even the interests of its shareholders to the greater good.